Welcome back to the Haunt Vault, where fear lurks in the spaces between the words. Tonight, we have a story that might just make you think twice before pressing play on your favorite horror tale. What happens when a story refuses to stay unfinished? When the line between fiction and reality begins to blur, some things are better left unheard. Brace yourself for the unfinished story, but remember, not all stories end when you expect them to. Fascinated by horror stories, Tamara could never bring herself to finish one. Every time she started, something inside her recoiled, a deep-rooted fear that crawled under her skin, urging her to stop before the tale reached its inevitable, terrifying conclusion. It wasn't the monsters, nor the bloodshed that unnerved her. It was the anticipation of what might come next. She often told herself it was ridiculous. "They're just stories," she would say, "fiction made up to scare people, nothing more." Yet the knot in her stomach tightened whenever the suspense built too high, whenever the unknown horrors lurked just beyond the next page or in the silence between words. So, she'd close the book, stop the recording, and retreat into the safety of unfinished stories. But that night was different. The evening had started like many others. Tamara, wrapped in a blanket, curled on her couch with the lights dimmed, had her headphones in, scrolling through a list of horror podcasts. The outside world was a world away. Only the faint sound of wind brushing the trees outside her apartment broke the stillness. She was alone, as she often preferred it to be. After scrolling through endless options, one title caught her eye, "The Voices in the Walls." The description was vague, and that intrigued her. The thumbnail showed nothing more than a shadowy silhouette behind a thin, tattered curtain. She hit play. The narrator's voice was soft, almost soothing, as the story began. It told of a woman, alone in her apartment, who began to hear faint whispers at night. At first they were unintelligible, just soft murmurings in the dark. But soon they grew louder, forming distinct words that seemed to speak directly to her. Tamara's heart raced as she listened, her body tensing. It was a familiar sensation, this creeping dread, but she kept listening despite herself. She was determined to make it further this time, to prove that her fears were unfounded. As the story progressed, the whispers became more insistent in the tale. The woman in the apartment would wake up to the voices calling her name, urging her to do things she didn't want to. Terrible things. Tamara's breath hitched, her fingers twitching toward the stop button. She hesitated, feeling the usual anxiety gnawing at her. "You've heard this before," she thought. "You know how these things end. Just stop now." But something about the narrator's voice compelled her to continue. There was an odd cadence to it, a lulling rhythm that made it hard to pull away. It was almost as though the voice was speaking directly to her, not just narrating a story, but whispering in her ear. The whispers in the podcast grew louder, more desperate, as the woman's world and the story began to unravel. She started seeing shadows where there should be none, hearing footsteps in the silence. The tension was unbearable. And then, just as the woman in the story reached the climax, when she was about to confront the source of the voices, the recording stopped. Tamara blinked. Her phone screen showed that the podcast was still playing, but there was no sound. The timer wasn't moving, frozen at the exact moment the story should have revealed its dark secret. A sense of unease spread through her. She tapped the screen, trying to skip ahead, to restart the episode, anything to fix the sudden silence. Nothing worked. Then came a sound, a faint, scratchy whisper. Tamara's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. It wasn't coming from her phone, it was behind her. Her throat tightened as she slowly pulled off her headphones. The whispering grew clearer, not the indistinct sound from the recording, but something closer, realer.
"Tamara."
She froze, her blood turning cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the story. But how? How could that be?
"Tamara, you're not finished yet.
The whisper came again, soft, insistent. Heart pounding, she turned to look behind her, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But there was nothing. Just the dim light from the hallway casting shadows over her furniture.
We're still waiting.
The voice was louder now, closer. She bolted upright, throwing her blanket aside, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be her imagination, a trick of the mind. Maybe she was just so absorbed in the story that her brain was playing tricks on her. That had to be it. The whispering continued, weaving itself through the walls, echoing in the corners of her apartment. Tamara's breath quickened. She stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to be closing in on her. But as her fingers grasped the doorknob, the voice shifted, its tone sharpening.
You can't leave. Not yet.
The door wouldn't budge. Her heart slammed in her chest as she yanked harder, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. The walls around her seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't place, vibrating with the weight of the voices inside them. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out.
Finish the story, Tamara.
The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was all around her, inside her. Panic surged through her as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, deeper. Her phone, still frozen on the podcast, buzzed in her hand, the screen flickering. The timer moved again, this time counting backward. The story wasn't over. The story wasn't finished. She stared at the screen, wide-eyed, as the seconds ticked down, her breathing ragged. The voice on the podcast resumed, but now it wasn't just telling a story. It was telling her story. Tamara thought she could escape the tale, but stories have a way of writing themselves. Now she's part of it, and the voices in the walls, they've been waiting for her. Tamara's blood ran cold. She dropped the phone, but the voice didn't stop. The words echoed around her apartment, bouncing off the walls, seeping into her mind. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Figures, dark, indistinct, slithered from the edges of her vision, their shapes warping as they drew closer.
You've listened long enough, Tamara.
One of the figures reached out, its shadowy hand extending toward her. Tamara stumbled back, hitting the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the phone on the floor, the podcast timer hitting 0. And then, silence. Thank you for joining us tonight on The Haunt Vault. If the unfinished story left you with chills or second thoughts about that next tale, you're not alone. If you enjoyed this unsettling journey, or if it kept you up a little too late, don't forget to hit that like button and share the fear with friends who might also be brave enough to listen. Subscribe for more terrifying tales and let us know in the comments, have you ever stopped a story only to wonder what might happen if it never really ended? Until next time, sleep tight.